Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the Senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. Welcome to this week's edition of Kibbitzing with Kagan. My guest today is my very dear friend and the director of Maryland Hunger Solutions, Michael J. Wilson. Michael J., thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you, Senator Kagan. Glad to be here with you.
Yay. So we're going to talk about Maryland Hunger Solutions and hunger insecurity and all that, but I want to start to give people an idea of your background because it's so impressive. So let's start with the fact that you're a son of Detroit and you're very proud of that. How do you think that affected your values and your career?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that growing up in Detroit, when I did, in the midst of the heyday of Motown, in the midst of the heyday of the auto industry, in an African American city in the middle of the country, I think it gave me a real feel for both the working class roots that I know that I have, the pride that I have in my own identity, and a willingness to share and work with others. It's just part of how I do all of my work.
Amen. That's so true. So you came to Washington. Talk about your time on Capitol Hill and then in the Labor Department. What did that teach you and how did that inspire you?
Yeah, Capitol Hill is interesting because it's like a master's degree in some ways. Whatever your undergraduate degree was, being on the Hill is like a master's degree in politics, in communications, in partnership, in all of those things, as well as geography around the different countries. So that was fascinating to be on Capitol Hill. Being in the Labor Department, being a political appointee many years ago, gave me a different perspective of not just what happens when legislation gets passed, but what happens when legislation gets implemented and how agencies, think about things and how they implement things and how different that is and how related it is. That was really interesting being in the inside of the Department of Labor.
So you and I first connected when you became National Director of ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, which
That's
was
correct.
an iconic, historic, progressive, dare I say, liberal advocacy and research organization. Why don't you talk about ADA, what it was in its history and what you were proud of having accomplished there?
So I think ADA was always the historic organization that kind of brought together all of the allies of liberal causes, from civil rights to women's rights to workers' rights. And it had, for many years, built upon that legacy. I think the thing I'm most proud of from my time there was understanding how things had changed over the years and how we needed to look forward rather than backwards of the history of the organization, about the importance of discrimination against LGBTQ folks who were not historically part of the coalition that ADA had worked on, and how we thought about the budget issues in a very proactive way, and not just to defend old programs. And so those are the things that I think I was mostly proud of. I think if I could add a third really quickly, I'd say, thinking about social media, thinking about how that had changed and how ADA had gotten left behind in some of that. Programmatically, I think that was helpful as well.
Yes. And we got to have some really important events convening. Let's just talk briefly. The What Would Martin Do annual events, both on Capitol Hill and at Howard University, that you and I worked on together and brought some really impressive panelists.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that wondering what Dr. King would do if he were still alive, if he were still here and as an advocate, is a thought exercise, amongst other things, about how we can all think about how we want to move forward, knowing that it's not 1968 any longer. And what kind of things would Dr. King do if we were so privileged as to have his leadership with us? And using that as a platform was always a good idea, a good plan, I thought.
Yes. And I remember, so many of the folks who knew Dr. King and worked with him, as well as those who were inspired by him or affected by him. That was great. So it's astonishing to think that it was 10 years ago, 2013, when you became director of Maryland Hunger Solutions. Yeah. So let's start by talking about what Maryland Hunger Solutions is, what it does, what its mission is, why people should even care that it exists.
Yeah, thank you. So Maryland Hunger Solutions is a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization very simply working to end hunger in the state of Maryland. And when you think about Maryland, Maryland is by per capita income one of the wealthiest states in the country. And yet still we have poverty, we have hunger in our state, a state that has 6 million residents, but has over 600,000 people even today using the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps by some folks. To know that of our 900,000 public school students across the state, that almost more than half of them get either free or reduced price meals, either because they're eligible or because their school is eligible for different programs. And we know the importance of the WIC program to make sure that
The women's, infants, and children.
that's correct, that the women, infants, and children and their toddlers and the pregnant moms who utilize that program, it's so important to feed them and to feed their brains and to feed their bodies at that critical time is another important program that we use here in the state of Maryland. And our work is always centered around the best and most effective use of existing food programs. We never touch food in the work that we do. If you really need food right away, we can refer you to a food bank, the Capital Area Food Bank, Manna Food Center in Montgomery County, to Maryland Food Bank and other parts of the state. That we can connect you to pantries and food banks in your community. But our work is really focused on making systemic changes so that we can really help impact folks who are impacted by food and by food insecurity.
So let's just talk for a second about the demographics or geographic stretch. A lot of people might just think Baltimore City, lower income, more hunger, insecurity, food insecurity. Talk about where else the need is located.
Right. So the need is located in Maryland everywhere.
Yep.
In every jurisdiction, in every county. We have a toll-free number, and I will share that later, where people who want to be able to get assistance doing SNAP applications can reach us, and we can help them. But we've gotten calls from every part of the state, from Western Maryland, from the Eastern Shore, from Baltimore, from Montgomery County, from Prince George's County, to Cal. Every place is impacted. And we have on our website at marylandhungersolutions.org a map that shows the data for every jurisdiction. There are people who have food insecurity everywhere in the state of Maryland, and there's no place that's exempt from that.
What was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, both on Maryland Hunger Solutions and on hunger?
Well, there's a long story.
So
I'll start with hunger because I think that's really more critical. You know, that there were lots of people who lost their jobs, lots of people who lost hours but continued to work, and lots of folks who found themselves eligible for federal nutrition programs for the first time. You know, shortly after the pandemic began and the shutdowns were happening, Maryland's SNAP participation went to the highest it's ever been in the state's history, over 850,000 people. And that is a huge number, but it was important that we were able to help people at that time because they were otherwise going to be really, really hurting. And I want to be clear, it's not just the people who get impacted, it's our overall food system. And so when we have the food system impacted, it's grocery stores, it's farmers, it's food processors, it's distributors, it's the folks driving the trucks, it's the folks who are, you know, catching the chickens. Every part of the food system is impacted. And so as bad as the pandemic was, and it was bad, what we were able to do as a nation and as a state was to utilize these programs in a very effective way. Healthy school meals for all. Every school student got breakfast and lunch, and we could pay for that by the federal and state government. And we found out that we could, that we had SNAP application assistance and had people get more benefits than they otherwise would have gotten. That was very helpful, not just for them, but for the food system. And so we've had a lot of changes that we've gone through. And my hope was that we could learn from the changes that we've made and that we could take some of those changes and those lessons learned forward. And we haven't done it as well as I'd like, but I hope that we'll continue to have conversations about that.
So it used to be that students had to sort of self-identify as I'm from a lower income family, and so I'm on a free and reduced meal. Talk about the importance of every student getting breakfast or lunch and how that has changed the dynamic in our schools.
Right. So we still have in many places, including in Montgomery County, the self-attestation of a family saying we get this much income, or we're on SNAP, or we're on Medicaid. And that self-attestation will make families eligible either for free meals or for reduced price meals.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of places around the state, including in Montgomery County, where we're using now what's known as the direct certification method. We have records at the state. We know who is eligible in using SNAP. We know who's eligible in using Medicaid. We know a lot about these families that we have in databases. And the 21st century way to measure poverty is just to check the box. We can see where we have large groups of schools that have free and reduced meals. And so that's why we have free meals throughout Somerset County. That's why we have free meals in big groups of schools in Washington County, while we have free meals in groups in Prince George's County and all through Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And so we're using direct certification to really measure poverty in a much more effective way. And that lets us use federal dollars to pay these kids meals debts. And we can avoid meal debts for kids, and we can avoid debts for school systems, food and nutrition offices as well.
Yep. So students who get nutritious meals during the school year, talk about summer, talk about spring break, talk about how that goes and how they get their healthy food there.
Right. So the first part I'd say is we all know that hungry kids can learn. Now,
Right.
kids who are hungry in classrooms are the kids who are not learning. They're the kids who are often disrupting classes. And so we need to make sure that we're feeding all of those kids so that we can actually have a good educational experience for all of the kids, not just the kids who've already eaten, but for all of the kids. And that's critically important.
Yep.
We also know that when school is not in session, like in the summer, that there's a documented hunger gap, just like there's a learning gap. When kids aren't in school, they're not getting the same academic enrichment that they are when they're in school. And then when they're when they don't have access to school breakfast and school lunch, there's a nutrition gap that's been documented by research.
Yeah.
And so the goal for us is to figure out how do we utilize school meals to help increase academic enrichment, to increase the health and the nutrition of kids. And so the pandemic EBT program, where kids were able to get money, electronic benefit transfer program. Yep. So when that happened during the pandemic, that was a help for lots of families to be able to just directly give them additional resources to buy food. And so we're looking at all of these things in ways that we can learn lessons from the pandemic, but how we can effectively feed kids and feed their brains so that they can be the leaders of Maryland in the future.
So so as you said, so many people are affected, not just hungry kids. So let's talk about, so the EBT, the electronic benefits transfer,
Right.
Talk about how you've engaged farmers markets.
Yeah, right. So we know farmers markets have the potential to be the place where Maryland comes together. It's the place where farmers, urban farmers as well as rural farmers, can come and sell products, where suburban families can come purchase food, and where urban families can purchase food. And in particular, low-income families can purchase food when we have the subsidy that we get through the Maryland Market Money Program.
Yes.
So what happens is there's matching money. If you come and spend X amount of dollars on buying fruits and vegetables at the farmer's market, it gets matched. Sometimes it's $5, sometimes it's $10, sometimes it's more. It needs to be more because that was what makes those farmers markets successful for farmers, for local communities, and for low income shoppers as well. And
I love that program. I mean, I love supporting farmers, but it tends to feel expensive. And I'm on a fairly restricted income as a legislator. And so it sometimes feels like a splurge. So the idea of a little bit of assistance for somebody who's really struggling just is brilliant.
Right.
Talk about, gosh, I still have so many questions. Talk about other coalitions. So the farmers market, you work with farmers and all those. Who else do you work with to help try to educate opinion leaders and legislators?
Yeah, I think it's important to do exactly what you said. We want to educate policymakers, we want to educate the press,
The
we want to
press?
educate the public about
Mhm,
all of these important programs. And
mhm.
so we're fortunate to work with the Maryland State Food Resilience Council. It's a council created by the state legislature to build resilience into our system so that we have farmers and state agencies and school officials and restaurants and all of us working together, pulling in the same direction, understanding the ways that we're all connected in the complicated food system. There's also the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which has pulled together a similar coalition in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And then there are critical food policy organizations, the Montgomery County Food Council, the Prince George's Food Equity Council, the Baltimore Food Pact. There are many others who are locally focused councils that deal with all these issues as well. The truth is our neighbors really are our neighbors, and that they are part of the food system with us, and we need to work with them, not just for today's meal, but to make sure that we're feeding all of our families.
Yes. So I actually had the Food Resiliency Council on my list to talk about, and I just want to make the point that it is housed within MDEM, the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, and people think of that as terrorism or floods or climate change or something, but it is also hunger emergencies. Do you want to talk briefly about how it feels to be sort of wedged in with other types of crises like that?
Well, I think it's important because we know that when you don't have food, it is an emergency, and if you're worried about getting food, it can be an emergency. We also know that there are so many state agencies that touch food. MDEM was the right place to house this. We have school meals in the Maryland Department of Education. We have the SNAP Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in the Department of Human Services. We have the Women's, Infants, and Children's programs in the Department of Health. And we also have a Department of Agriculture.
Agriculture, yep.
I mean, all of these different
Yep.
agencies, the place where they most connect is at the Food System Resilience Council, because we want to make sure that we're working together for farmers as well as for consumers.
Yep, makes total sense. So I realize that Maryland Hunger Solutions is, and as you said at the very beginning, nonpartisan, non-political, all that. But I wonder about the transition that has happened in the last several months between the Hogan administration and the Moore administration. And I wonder what policy differences you've seen, if any, so far.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I think we haven't fully recognized all the changes yet. I am hopeful because we work on issues, and amongst my staff, we work on issues without ever using the words Democrat or Republican. That's not how we do work. We talk about hunger, we talk about school meals, we talk about SNAP, we talk about the programs.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be advocates for the programs, regardless of who is in public office.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one thing I've noticed more recently is more of an openness to have a conversation than there was 6 months or a year ago. I am hopeful that some of the policy differences can be felt. But to be honest, we've made progress over the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
Not as much as we'd like, but we'd like to make more. So we are hopeful that more progress will come
Yes.
in the near future.
So we are in the final weeks of the 90-day legislative session. Why don't you talk about some of your priorities that you're hoping you can get accomplished this session?
Yeah. So I will say two things. We have some legislative priorities, but we also have programmatic priorities that may fall within the governor's ability to do things without depending on the legislature. So the things in the legislature, I'd say at the top of the list are, we want to move forward to have healthy school meals for all students. That's one of our priorities. We want to make sure that all the kids get fed. We want to avoid school meal debt. We've got a school breakfast program, the Maryland Meals for Achievement program, which provide funding for breakfast in the classroom. We're having conversations about campus hunger. We're having conversations about senior hunger. We're trying to do all of the pieces that we can to try to address as much of this as possible. Beyond that, We've got real concerns about the end of some of the pandemic benefits which have happened, which is going to have a dramatic reduction in benefits for a lot of people. And that's going to have an impact on hundreds of thousands of Marylanders. And it's going to have an impact on every place where there's a grocery store, where there's a
Yes.
farmer's market. We're going to take about $1 billion out of the system for the state of Maryland within the course of the year. And you can't take $1 billion out with impact without impacting lots of people.
So talk about, there's some people who say there's a workforce shortage. Why don't people who don't have enough money for food, why don't they just go out and get a job? Talk to that if you would.
So I will. I like the opportunity to talk about this question because when we look at SNAP participants in the state of Maryland, the reality is the majority of the folks who get SNAP are children, seniors, and disabled. The majority are children, seniors, and disabled, and nobody's expecting most of them to go out and just get a job. Most of the rest of the people who are on SNAP are working. They are the working poor. The problem in the American economy right now is that there are people who are working and don't earn enough or get enough hours to escape poverty.
Right.
That's a critical economic problem that faces this nation and this state, regardless of what you think about SNAP. That there are people who are working, full time, but not escaping poverty, and they work at many of the employers you can think about throughout the state of Maryland. But how do we make sure that people who are working earn enough so that they don't depend on these programs? But as long as they're eligible, we want to make sure that they're getting the food that they need to do the work that they're doing. And then the last part, there are some folks who have a hard time getting a job. And it's hard to get a job when you're homeless. It's hard to get a job when you're coming out of incarceration. And it's hard to get a job for lots of reasons. And so I want to be thoughtful and not just accusing people. I want to be thoughtful about the reasons why people are not working enough so that they can actually earn enough to take care of themselves, as most of them would love to do.
Yes. So one of the ways that I think you have been so effective during your tenure has been in the way that you have tried to educate average Marylanders, or as you said, the press and opinion leaders, policymakers, and others. So just recently was Hear the Crunch, and I see the apples over your shoulder, and there you go. And I crunched again this year, of course, and tweeted it. And then the SNAP challenge, where people had to live on, was it $33, $37? I can't remember now. It was a bunch of years ago, for a week. And it was hard. And I did it, but it was hard. I was thinking about my next meal all the time. And that was to try to teach people about the limitations, the realities of food insecurity. So why don't you talk about those and whether you think they've been effective at spreading the word?
Well, I'll say this about their effectiveness. I think whenever we do these kinds of activities, they are effective, but they aren't effective at reaching everyone. And so our goal is to be as broad and as thoughtful as we can. I think the thing about the Hear the Crunch, which is so friendly to everyone, is that it's so easy to do, which is to bite an apple and to use that as a crunch, because it really does.
Take a picture, tweet it, hashtag Hear the Crunch.
Yeah, it's to focus on how every kid should start the day with a healthy breakfast. And the apple is symbolic in that regard. It doesn't have to be an apple. We all know that, but it's symbolic because we want every kid to start every day with a healthy breakfast. We know that in school systems across the state and across the country, that if it's testing time, they make sure kids have breakfast because they want them to test well. We need kids to have breakfast every day. So that they can be good students and good citizens in their classroom. So that's the first part. On the SNAP challenge is really hard because what it has is it teaches people about the limitations of the SNAP program because the benefits are so insufficient.
Yeah.
And nobody in their right mind wants to live on $30 a week. And I've done it several times, and it's a real challenge and it's a problem. And, maybe people get money in other ways. I understand that. Maybe SNAP isn't their only way. But the SNAP challenge is an exercise in both understanding and in empathy for folks who really do have that challenge. And, everybody won't take it. and everybody won't take it and get the same lesson. But I know that people who do take the challenge learn a little bit about not only the system, but about themselves. I know I did.
And the limitations of choices. I ate a lot of lentil soup that week. and,
Right.
and I like lentil soup, but not like 4 days in a week or 5 days. It was all the time. How does Maryland rank vis-a-vis other states, either in the region or nationally, in terms of, just talk about any aspect of that.
So, Maryland ranks different ways. We've done some things well. We've done other things we need to do better. We have people who are eligible for SNAP who are not utilizing it, and we view that as not a success. I don't want to call it a failure, but it's not a success.
Mm-hmm.
We have challenges. We do pretty well in school breakfast in terms of kids who are eligible for free and reduced meals who actually get breakfast. We're in the top quarter of the states that do that, but that's still a competition amongst other states that are doing much worse,
Mm-hmm.
I think the real challenge in terms of thinking about us vis-a-vis other states is really what percentage of folks who are eligible for programs and who are not utilizing programs are still facing food insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
That's the challenge.
Yes.
And that's always really a measure of poverty. And so what are we doing to address poverty more broadly, but food insecurity more specifically? And that's really the hard measure to look at.
Mm-hmm. Just a few more questions before we get to our Fast Five. First, what is your proudest accomplishment in your tenure so far at Maryland Hunger Solutions?
So I've got a tie. When we did community eligibility and we're able to have schools, that school systems be able to feed all of those kids, Baltimore City went in the next day and 80,000 kids got free meals. That's a big accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I know that tomorrow somebody will call our toll-free line and they will be able to get SNAP application assistance and they will be able to get food. And for them, nothing's more important than that. And I really recognize that's an important achievement as well.
That's awesome. So when you said it's a tie, I was talking about the fact that you're the bow tie guy and that's what you were referencing.
No, I was getting 2 bites at the apple is what I was doing.
There you go. That too. Good punning here. Hey, maybe you ought to compete in a pun competition.
It wouldn't be fair to the others.
There you go. If someone wanted to volunteer, how could they help your work? And if someone wanted to donate, what would the money be used for? How's that for a softball way to start to wrap up?
So, if people want to volunteer, we will accept volunteers. Our volunteers are different than people who volunteer at the food bank. You could volunteer at a food bank tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll put you to work, packing boxes and packing bags. And that's all good stuff. People who volunteer for us have to be trained.
Yes.
Because we have to have people who have a knowledge of the system. And if you're going to help people do SNAP application assistance, you've got to train you to do SNAP application assistance.
Yeah.
And we have a great need for people who speak multiple languages, but we are willing to take volunteers, and I would recommend going to our website, marylandhungersolutions.org. There's a place for you to reach out to us if you're interested in doing that. Similarly, the funds that we get money mostly from grants, though we get some from individuals. It lets us do both the outreach that we do, whether it's in Montgomery County or Baltimore City, wherever people are in need. It also lets us do the advocacy that we're doing, both the state legislature, but also at the federal level. They're going to rewrite the farm bill at the federal level, and that's going to impact all of the programs that we care about and that feed so many hundreds of thousands of Marylanders.
Great. Well, Michael J., it is time for the Fast Five. Five quick questions, 5 quick answers. Question number 1, and I know the answers to some of these. So question number 1, what is your favorite sport to play or watch?
Baseball. I'm a baseball guy.
And your team is?
I'm a Tiger fan.
Tigers.
I was a Tiger fan when they won the World Series in '68, and I've been there ever since.
There you go. Question 2, your favorite author. You are a prolific, voracious reader. Who's your favorite author?
I'm Historically, I would have said Ralph Ellison, but right now I'm a big fan of Michael Lewis, who does the best explanation of macroeconomics that I think anybody's doing out there right now.
Okay. Question 3. What advice would you give to someone who was just entering politics or policy?
Learn as much as you can, read as much as you can, work as hard as you can in every place that you get an opportunity, because you never know where that will take you.
That's great. Question 4. What is your favorite place to play in Maryland?
Favorite place to play? Wow. Favorite place to play? That one I didn't expect. You know, I love going to Camden Yards because that's the ballpark. I'll say that. That's how about that?
Okay. And then the 5th question, the one that I ask every one of my guests, Michael J. Wilson, Director of Maryland Hunger Solutions. What is your hidden secret superpower? What's a skill or talent you have, something you're really good at that most folks can't do?
Oh, I don't know that most folks can't do it, but here's what I would say. I refuse to accept defeat. I think defeat is an opportunity to come back and to refight that fight. And I remember once somebody asked me, "What do you do if a bill doesn't pass?" And I'm like, "What do you mean if it doesn't pass? It just means it didn't pass this time. We're going to be back." And so I think it's very important to understand what defeat looks like and what and when defeat is an opportunity.
Amazing. You're wonderful. Thank you for taking time. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for being such a dear and trusted confidant and friend for so many years now. I look forward to seeing you again before too long.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on the Kibbitzing.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye-bye.